Hello and welcome to Written Words. If you've been following my posts on social media, you will have seen that this year I'm planning a slightly different format for the videos. Instead of the numbered lesson format, I'm going to choose a theme for each month, and all the videos in that month will be around that theme. There will be some background information about language, there will be some literature, and there will also be the usual writing prompts, language focus, etc. So this month's theme is the origins of English. And I'm going to look at where English came from, how it developed, and how it became the language that we recognise today. So for this video, we're going to start by looking at a timeline of the English language and all the various different influences that have shaped it over the centuries. To start with, we're going to go all the way back to pre-Roman times. Before the Romans came, Britain was inhabited by people called Celts. The Celts themselves weren't originally from Britain. They too came here from mainland Europe somewhere between 600 and 300 BC. But by the time the Romans arrived, they were quite settled here. There were two main groups of Celts. There were the Britons, who mainly lived in the south of the country, and the Goidels or the Gaels, who lived further north. And naturally, they had their own language. The Celts weren't very big on writing, so we don't have much in the way of written language from Celtic times. But they would have had their own language that they spoke. And when the Romans arrived, the Celts moved towards the edges of the country. The Gaels moved further north, and the Britons moved west and south. And we can see evidence still to this day of their language. Scottish and Irish, Gaelic or Gaelic, developed from the language of the Gaels who moved further north. And the Welsh language, the Cornish language, and the Breton language is descended from the language of the Britons who moved west and south. So then around about 55 BC and onwards until 400 AD-ish, the Romans came. And the Romans brought with them their ways, their customs, their culture, and their language, which in their case was Latin. And unlike the Celts, the Romans did quite a lot of writing, so we have quite a lot of written language left behind from Roman times. Then, as the Roman Empire began to collapse in the 400s AD, another group of people started to arrive in Britain. They didn't come all in one go. They came gradually over a period of several hundred years. And these people came from the northern part of mainland Europe. They were Angles, Saxons, Jutes and Frisians who came from the area around what is now Germany. And they too brought their customs, their culture, their ways of doing things, and their languages. And their languages were Germanic in origin. Somewhere along the way, history decided to discard the names of the Frisians, the Jutes, and various other groups of people who came, and retained only the Angles and the Saxons. And we now know them as the Anglo-Saxons. And the language that they spoke we call Anglo-Saxon or Old English. So the Anglo-Saxons came, they settled, they established their way of life in this country. And then a few hundred years later, beginning with a particularly horrific raid on the island of Lindisfarne in 793, the Vikings began to arrive. They came from Scandinavia and they brought with them their Norse language and customs and culture. So for a period of a few hundred years, the Norsemen and the Anglo-Saxons existed together, and their languages both fed into what became an early form of English. The next major disruption to the country was in 1066. In 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, the Anglo-Saxon King Harold was killed by the armies of William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror was a Norman. He came from Normandy in what is now France, and the Normans brought with them their language, which was Norman French. The word Norman actually means Norseman, and the Normans themselves had originally come from Scandinavia and settled in France, and the language that they spoke was a variety of French, although slightly different to the French that was spoken in other parts of France at the time. So from 1066 onwards, French, or Norman French, became the language of the ruling classes in England. And this lasted for just over 300 years. For over 300 years, the royal family in England spoke only French. And it wasn't until 1399, when Henry IV came to the throne, that English began to be spoken at court. So as a result, French was the language of the ruling classes. It was also the language of governance and administration. So because of that, a lot of French words were assimilated into the English vocabulary. A lot of legal and financial terminology comes from French. At the same time, the ordinary people, the commoners, still spoke Anglo-Saxon or Old English, so there were two official languages in the country for quite some time. So the Norman invasion was probably the last large-scale upheaval in the English language. After that, things began to settle down a little, and gradually the written language became more widespread. More people became able to read. More people could write. The printing press was invented, and so books and printed matter became much more widespread. And with that, there became an urgent need to standardize the language. When a language exists in its spoken form and the people don't move around very much, you end up with lots of regional variations, and people in one region would speak very differently to the people in another region. But as the written language became increasingly widespread, it became very important to standardize the language so that somebody in one part of the country could understand the same written matter as somebody in a different part of the country. It was around about that time that Chaucer was writing his Canterbury Tales, and it's a little bit awkward if you're writing a book and only people in the 3 streets around you can read that book. So there was a steady movement towards standardization of the language. All the influences that we've looked at so far on our timeline have been inbound influences. They have been people who have come to Britain and brought their language with them and influenced the development of the English language. But from the Tudor times onwards, there was more outbound movement. From the 16th to the 20th century, the British Empire emerged. In Tudor times, the British people became interested in exploration and exploitation. They wanted to know what was out there in the rest of the world and how they could profit from it. Trade routes were established, agreements were signed, colonies were set up, trading posts were established all over the world. And this lasted for several hundred years. British people sailed to North America. They thought it might be a really good idea to send their unwanted prisoners to Australia. And after a while of doing that, they realised that actually there were a lot of useful resources in Australia that could be tapped to their benefit. So people went out there to settle as well. They went to lots of different countries in Asia and all over Africa. So just as other nations had done to them in the previous centuries, they now started to do to other countries. As they travelled to other countries, they took with them their ways, their customs, their religion, and their language. However, the language so far had evolved in the British Isles. People had developed the language to talk about their experience of life in the British Isles, its geography, its climate, its natural flora and fauna. And suddenly they were going to other countries where all these things were different. And the language naturally needed to adapt to these situations. And of course, the easiest way to adapt a language to another culture is to assimilate words from that other culture. So the travellers who explored the world during that time came back with words such as barbecue, canoe, bungalow, zombie, banana, chimpanzee, words that had never existed in English before. Even the nickname blighty, which British people used to refer to their country, came from India. It came from the word vilayati, which the Indian people used to refer to these British people who had come to their country. It means foreigners. So the people of Old Blighty were foreigners in India. So with this movement of British people all around the world colonising and trading, English became the language of business and trade. But in the 20th century, the British Empire began to fade. The former colonies became independent countries. But then two other phenomena arose which had an impact on the English language. One was the availability of travel. Whereas travelling to other countries was an unusual thing to do for ordinary people, now we have all kinds of transport. We have cars and trains and planes, and we can travel all over the world. We don't blink an eye at the idea of hopping on a plane and going to another country. So global travel has become much more widespread. And as people travel around the world, they take their languages with them. So English words find their way into other languages, and words from other languages have found their way into English because of the way people move so much around the world now. And the other phenomenon is, of course, the internet. We don't even have to leave our homes in order to speak to someone in a different country. We can talk to someone on the other side of the world from the comfort of our front room. The internet is truly global. There are no national boundaries. You don't have to have a passport to talk to someone in a different country. And of course, English is the most used language on the internet. Speakers of all languages and cultural backgrounds use English to communicate. And this results in yet more linguistic adaptations. New words have arrived into English and other languages because of their usage on the internet. Although English still does have many regional variations, we've also ended up with a kind of international English, a kind of business English that people can understand from all regional backgrounds, thus making communication easier and more effective. There are a lot of universal words now that exist in English but are the same in other languages. Words like computer, internet, chat, for example, are the same in lots of languages. So now we've brought our timeline up to the present day. But what lies ahead? What will the English language look like in 100 years' time? Where will it go from here? Will it still be a global language, or will something else have taken its place? Will we all be speaking identical English, or will the regional variations still exist? What do you think? How do you think the English of the future will look? Feel free to share your ideas and your predictions in the comments. I'd be very interested to see what your thoughts are on that. So now that we've taken a look at our timeline and the key points in the history of the English language and how it came to be, My next video is going to look at some examples from literature. I'm going to look at some key literary works that show the development of the English language. Thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. And in the meantime, happy reading and happy writing.